Can a president leading a nation through war, a leader who hasn't faced an election in years because of that very conflict, actually be considered a dictator?
It's a really stark question, isn't it? And it's one that, well, it definitely hangs over Volodymyr Zelensky's leadership in Ukraine, especially now the war with Russia is dragging into its third year.
Yeah, it really is.
So today we're doing a deep dive into this analysis called Zelensky as an Unelected Dictator, a critical examination.
Okay.
And it basically lays out the argument suggesting that, his long time in office without elections, plus this noticeable increase in centralized power could point towards authoritarianism.
Right.
But, and this is important, the analysis does acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances, the war.
Absolutely. And look, our aim here isn't to pick sides. It's an incredibly complicated situation.
Yeah, sure.
What we want to do is unpack the main arguments in this analysis, look at the evidence it puts forward both for and against this pretty provocative claim.
Yeah, the idea is to equip you, the listener, with a clearer picture of all the different facets.
Okay, let's get into it then. The analysis kicks off by looking at how Zelensky actually got into power. It's quite a backstory.
It really is. And what's maybe most striking is the jump from his background to, where he is now. He was a comedian, famously played a teacher who becomes president on TV.
Listen to the people.
Exactly. And life kind of imitated art there, didn't it?
Totally. And then, boom, 2019, he wins this landslide in a real democratic election, ran on an anti-corruption ticket.
Beat Poroshenko, got something like 73% of the vote. Huge mandate. It felt like a big moment for Ukrainian democracy back then.
It really did.
So he started off with this crystal clear democratic legitimacy. But the analysis we're looking at, it really zeroes in on how things shifted after Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022.
Right. The context changed completely.
And now critics are saying, look, staying in power without elections, that goes against those democratic roots, which leads to this argument that he's essentially an unelected leader here in 2025.
Okay, so that takes us straight to the really thorny issue, no elections. We need to understand the legal side of this first.
We do. The Ukrainian constitution, it's quite explicit. You cannot hold elections while martial law is in effect.
And martial law was declared right after the invasion, February 24th, 2022.
Makes sense practically speaking. You've got chunks of the country occupied, millions of people displaced internally and externally, huge numbers serving in the military, holding a fair, safe election. It's a massive challenge.
So Zelensky points to Article 108 of the Constitution. That's his justification.
Yeah, that article says the president keeps serving until a successor is elected. Pretty straightforward on the surface.
But the analysis we're digging into, it flags this as a potential problem.
This is where the loophole argument comes in. Critics say, okay, that's what the Constitution says, but the war, it doesn't have a clear end in sight, does it?
No.
So could this effectively mean he stays in power indefinitely without ever facing the voters again? That's really the core of the unelected critique now in 2025.
The analysis compares it to the UK suspending elections during World War II. But it says there's a big difference.
Yeah, that comparison comes up. But the analysis argues the key differences. Well, back then, the UK legislation had sunset clauses. There was some kind of, albeit fuzzy, idea of getting back to normal post-war.
Right.
In Ukraine's case, the martial law doesn't have that kind of defined endpoint built in. And that lack of definition, it fuels the whole concern.
And the analysis seems pretty critical of Zelensky for not maybe exploring other options more actively.
Exactly. It highlights criticism that he hasn't really pushed for alternatives, like, say, formally delegating more presidential powers to the parliament, the Verkhovna Rada.
Or even just planning for conditional elections, like if certain conditions are met.
Right. Or even laying out a clearer roadmap for when elections could potentially happen. This perceived lack of trying to find democratic workarounds, well, it feeds the narrative that maybe he's using the situation to hang on to power.
Okay, so the election issue is central. Then building on that, the analysis looks at how this period without a mandate might be leading to more concentrated power.
Yes, that's the next big piece. The analysis talks about a growing concentration of power around Zelensky and his inner circle. This is often seen as, a marker of authoritarian tendencies.
And it names his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, specifically.
It does. Yermak, who is unelected, is portrayed as having immense influence on policy. The suggestion is he sometimes bypasses the usual parliamentary processes.
And this control extends quite broadly.
According to the analysis, yes. It points to centralized decision-making in 2025, across the board, military stuff, diplomacy, even economic policy.
It mentions rejecting a U.S. minerals deal as an example.
That's cited as one specific instance,
Yeah.
showing that key decisions are being made very centrally.
The analysis also brings up something about regional autonomy eroding. That was interesting.
That's a significant point it raises. It mentions local governance reforms and appointing people seen as loyalists to key regional posts. So, while you could argue centralization is needed for wartime unity, critics see it as deliberately weakening those independent local power centers.
So the argument is basically that wartime needs might require quick decisions, but Zelensky could be using this crisis to actually dig in and strengthen his personal authority.
That's exactly the concern the analysis highlights. It brings up things like disputes with the Constitutional Court over anti-corruption stuff
Right.
as potential signs of wanting to weaken those independent checks and balances on presidential power. Actions that, even if framed as necessary for survival, can look like tactics used by leaders who put control above democratic accountability.
Okay, then the analysis shifts focus to crackdowns on opposition and media. Always a sensitive area in wartime.
Extremely sensitive. The analysis does acknowledge the government's reasoning for banning pro-Russian parties, like Opposition Platform for Life.
Citing links to the Kremlin needing to counter Russian influence.
Exactly. Necessary security measures is the argument. But the analysis immediately pivots to the risk. Could these measures then be used more broadly to shut down any dissent, not just pro-Russian voices?
And it suggests independent media has felt some pressure too.
It points to reports, pressure, maybe even intimidation, against independent journalists who've been critical of the government's war strategy, which, can create a chilling effect.
Limits the range of views people hear.
Definitely. And then there's the United News Telemarathon, set up back in 2022.
Ah, yes, the unified broadcast.
Right. Intended to create a single, unified national message during the crisis. Which makes sense in one way. But the flip side is it consolidates control over TV news.
Reduces space for alternative takes or critical analysis.
That's the concern. Though it's worth noting the analysis does say opposition figures like Petro Poroshenko are still politically active.
Okay, so not completely silenced.
Not completely, but perhaps their influence is less than it was. The analysis quotes the source warning that these wartime restrictions on free expression, even if they're not like Russia's total crackdown, could become normalized if they go on too long.
Right.
The underlying argument is that a democratic leader, even in war, should ideally be looking for ways to restore pluralism as soon as it's feasible.
And these policies, the analysis suggests, could fit that authoritarian pattern of prioritizing control over allowing dissent. What about public support, though? Does that factor in?
It does. The analysis looks at public support directly. It mentions polls from early 2025, one showing around 57% trust, another suggesting over 70% approval. So on the surface, still quite high.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Always. The analysis adds some important caveats. First, those numbers are down quite a bit from the nearly 90% approval he had right after the invasion.
Sure, war fatigue, economy, setbacks. Yeah, makes sense.
Exactly. But more fundamentally, the analysis questions how reliable polls really are under martial law. With media restrictions, opposition curbs, do polls truly capture public opinion?
It could skew the results.
It could. The analysis even mentions Trump's wild claim about 4% approval, which was fact-checked as totally false.
Right, that was debunked.
But the core point the analysis makes is, even if he has significant support, that doesn't automatically mean authoritarian concerns are invalid. It draws a parallel, maybe controversially, to someone like Hugo Chavez.
Who was popular but still seen as undermining democracy.
Precisely. Popularity alone isn't the only measure of democratic health.
What about that report of Zelensky offering to resign?
The analysis mentions reports he suggested he'd step down if Ukraine got NATO membership or a solid peace deal.
Which seems unlikely anytime soon.
Very unlikely. So it's seen mostly as symbolic. The bottom line in the analysis is that without elections, his legitimacy increasingly hangs on public tolerance, which might not be stable long term.
And this whole unelected dictator narrative, it's obviously being pushed by certain players.
Oh, absolutely. The analysis is very clear that Russia hammers this label constantly. It serves their goal of delegitimizing Zelensky, justifying their invasion. It's pure propaganda from their side.
And Trump's social media post from February 2025 just amplified that.
Exactly. Him repeating that Kremlin line, dictator without elections, prolonging the war for U.S. aid, shows how the narrative gets picked up and used for other agendas.
The analysis also touches on Ukraine's reliance on Western aid, suggesting it might compromise sovereignty.
It mentions that perception, yes, that relying so heavily on the West could raise questions about autonomy.
But then it also brings up him rejecting that U.S. minerals proposal.
Right, as a counterpoint,
Yeah.
showing he's not just doing whatever the West says. But the analysis argues that while that shows some independence, it doesn't really erase the domestic concerns about centralized power and no sections.
How are other world leaders handling this narrative?
Well, European leaders, like Starmer in the UK or Scholz in Germany, have generally defended his legitimacy. They point to the war constraints.
Understandable.
But the analysis kind of hints that maybe this international support papers over some genuine unease within Ukraine about democratic norms potentially slipping.
So the narrative is exploited, but it also touches on real concerns.
That's the crux of it. While adversaries definitely weaponize the label, it also resonates because of these genuine questions about its current status and the way power seems to be centralizing.
Okay, so what about the arguments defending Zelensky? What do his supporters, or those who reject the dictator label, point to?
Well, the main defense is that he is a wartime leader operating within a democratic framework just under extreme duress.
And the evidence for that?
They point to things like Ukraine still has an active press, even with restrictions. There's vocal opposition, even if it's marginalized. Parliament, the Rada, is still functioning. All things you absolutely do not see in Russia.
That's a fair point. The contrast with Russia is stark.
And they highlight Ukraine's history, 7 democratic presidential elections since '91, very different from Putin's long autocratic rule.
And the martial law itself has a basis in the Constitution.
Yes, it's constitutional, and importantly, it has to be reviewed and renewed by Parliament every 90 days.
So there is parliamentary oversight.
There is. And the analysis even notes that key opposition figures, like Poroshenko, seem to have implicitly accepted the need for martial law to continue for now.
But the analysis pushes back on these defenses too.
Yeah, it does. The core rebuttal is, okay, temporary measures might be necessary now, but what's the plan to roll them back? There's a real danger they become permanent without a clear roadmap back to full democracy after the war.
The temporary becomes the new normal.
Potentially. The analysis cites the Journal of Democracy, making the point that all the positive democratic reforms Ukraine made before the war are now kind of being overshadowed by this wartime centralization. So the final thought in the analysis is pretty sobering. It says, look, Zelensky's government is obviously far less invasive than Putin's Russia, no question.
Right.
But the current path, with power consolidating and no elections, raises real fears about democratic backsliding. And that, in practice, gives fuel to this view of him governing effectively as an unelected dictator.
Right. So summing up our deep dive into this analysis then,
Yeah.
it paints a really critical picture of Zelensky's leadership right now. It flags the lack of elections, the way power seems to be concentrating, the curbs on dissent, all as potential signs of an authoritarian drift, especially because the war keeps dragging on.
Yeah, and it's just so crucial to hold on to the context, isn't it? The sheer scale of the conflict, the existential threat Ukraine faces, and the arguments that these measures, however difficult, are necessary for national survival. It's just incredibly complex. There's strong points on all sides.
Definitely. So thinking about everything we've unpacked from this analysis today, here's something maybe for you to chew on. At what point do wartime measures taken out of necessity, start to fundamentally change the democratic soul of a country? And maybe even more importantly, who gets to decide where that line actually is?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really